Hey guys, welcome back to the Prehistoric Life Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Crawford, and today we're with Dinosaur Skeletons. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I sure can. Hello, my name's Alex, and I am a professional paleoartist from the United Kingdom, and I run a company called Dinosaur Skeletons.
So, it's so great to actually have you on finally and to be able to talk to you face to face. So I guess the basic question that I start off all interviews with is, what is your favorite dinosaur?
Favorite dinosaur? It has to be Psittacosaurus, I think. I'm a huge fan of the underdog dinosaurs. Like, you've got all the A-listers like Velociraptor and Tyrannosaurus and stuff, but the little guys that paved the way for the big dinosaurs, they're definitely the things that are like really in my heart.
The start of the tree, the start of a whole lineage that's Psittacosaurus. So what is it that you do? What is it that your company does?
So my company specializes in creating life-size prehistoric replicas for collectors and museums. It started off kind of in the museum realm, and I've just recently opened up to the public to allow everybody to kind of have an affordable way of getting a life-size specimen. But also it kind of allows people to get something they wouldn't have had. So it taps into the markets of, the people that have got their kind of man caves, and then you've got the people that are the really big enthusiasts that love everything about dinosaurs, all the way through to the professionals that want to research and things like that. And it just gives everyone a kind of a broad range of being able to get an affordable specimen that isn't kind of, out of reach for the everyday person, really.
And here's that website now if you guys want to go check it out, although you can't actually see the URL link now that I'm looking at it. Dinosaurskeletons.co.uk. Whenever it comes up, you can definitely just go place your order and you'll be happy to create it for you. But how about could you talk about the journey to get to where you are today? What led you down this?
Definitely. Yeah, sure. So like most people that are kind of crazy enough to get into this world, I was the typical kid that was obsessed with Jurassic Park and Walking with Dinosaurs. Being from the UK, Walking with Dinosaurs was a massive thing for us growing up. I'm a 90s kid, so I was just prime time for Jurassic Park upwards. So I was obsessed with all of that, and I'd always had an artistic flair. So I went off and trained as a traditional sculptor in a pottery, doing animal sculptures. And that was kind of my bread and butter for a few years. I then decided to go to university, and I got a first-class degree in art and design, where I specialized in sculpture and sound sculpture. And while I was at university, that's where kind of the dino kind of thing went from just being like a childhood obsession into adulthood, into kind of like, oh, this could turn into a career of some kind, but I have to make the career for myself. So while I was studying art and design, my degree, I pretty much undertook every course that I could that was available for cheap or free, to kind of like the online university courses and things like that, like Open University in the UK, to get qualifications in paleobiology. So I studied that for a few years alongside my degree. And then while I was at university, I realized that art and design is quite a hard thing to get a job in, unless you're going into like car design or you're going into like product design and things like that. So I realized I wasn't going to become like the next Turner Prize winner or anything like that. So I needed to get a job. So I reached out to a collectibles company called Rebor, and I've worked for Rebor for about 10 years now, working on toy sculptures. And then from there, it branched into creating in my own time skeletons, where I was like, I want this in my house, in my office. And it was only when I started creating them that I had a few people say, oh, that's really cool. Like, maybe you should think about selling that. And I was like, oh, I don't know. It's just something that I've made. And you kind of become blindsided to what you're doing. So you don't really realize that you've actually got something really nice that people would like. And then from there, I just put a post up on Facebook saying, like, this is a skeleton that I've made. Would anyone like to, own one? And a natural history museum in the UK got in touch, and they wanted a few specimens from me. It went from there, and it kind of just snowballed. And then I created the first skeletal reconstruction of a dinosaur called Berthosaura from Brazil. And then that kind of just skyrocketed it alongside my Bambiraptor reconstruction, where people started to just take notice. And then since then, it's just snowballed and gone on and on.
So you've just that's actually really crazy that like one of the first people that got in touch with you was just an actual museum.
Yeah, really lucky. It's just a small history museum, and it kind of just kickstarted where I met some amazing people, some really, really talented paleontologists and preparators. So yeah, shout out to Emnia Prep. They're really cool couple who have started doing prep in the UK, and they're getting worldwide clients, and they're really cool. I met a lovely lady called Izzy, who is amazing, and she's a very talented paleontologist who is doing her PhD in Scotland. There was a guy called Jake, who's a brilliant CT guy. I've got to give them all shout outs because they were just kind of the people that helped push my career, really. And then there was Maddie as well. There was an Oliver. There was a lot of people to name, but yeah, they were really, really nice guys who all worked in this little history museum in Yorkshire. We all disbanded from there because we realized we could go and do our own things. And we've started various businesses, and it was kind of like a collective at first, where we were all just kind of like, what should we do with our lives? We've got to like kind of reach out into the paleontology world. They'd all like qualify from university, doing their preparing for PhDs and things like that. And I'd come in as just, I'm an artist, a starving artist, and I need to, pursue this passion that I've got. And because they were like the first clients that I had, we built a really strong friendship, and it just went from there and gained contacts from them. And it's just, it's gone really, really well. Thanks to like this little crew that we had at the beginning.
So going into this very unique field of fossil reconstruction, not out of a cast, but with like 3D printing, what are some of the challenges with that process altogether?
So I think one of the challenges of it being in the 3D market is I think it gets written off a fair bit by people because they think, well, I could print it myself. I could do X, Y, and Z myself. And there's vendors out there that will provide 3D files online. However, people that have seen my work in the flesh, well, in the bones, I should say. It was a terrible pun. Terrible joke, I'm sorry. But yeah, people have actually seen like the fossil reconstructions themselves have gone, okay, this is more than just like a 3D print. This is like better than cast, like how are you achieving this detail? So one of the challenges is breaking that hurdle, breaking that wall that, yes, because it's 3D printed, it's, a way that I can manufacture, but it doesn't mean that it's a lesser quality thing. It's not like a hobby grade thing that you've got on your desk. This is something that outdoes casts and actually can inform research and give a platform to, capturing data that would be lost during a casting process. Then it's the kind of the other challenge is kind of combining ways to make it durable, I guess. So I add polymers and things like that to the resin to make it more durable than standard resins that you won't kind of get on the market. And then because I'm a traditional sculptor, I think what sets me apart from other people on the market is no specimen is just the same. I will sculpt on top of every specimen traditionally as well if needed. to enhance and bring up the detail, or to tweak elements to make everything bespoke, because everything that I do is bespoke to the client. It's not just a 3D print file. Everything gets tweaked from day one all the way through. So even if you've got the same kind of Velociraptor reconstruction, it's not strictly the same, because there will be changes. So it's kind of adapting to the 3D print kind of style can be very stale. It can be that you've just got the file, you click print, and people write it off because it's a 3D print, and making it into an art form in itself. And I would refer to it just as a tool. It's no different from creating a mold and taking a cast, because I do that as well. But sometimes it's quicker just to print a femur than it is to build a mold, cast it, pull it out, get rid of air bubbles, things like that. So yeah, it's just breaking those walls down. I think that's the main challenge, is changing people's perception of 3D printing. We're past the days of, there being lines in your prints and things like that.
So the whole, each one being an individual is kind of, I'm sure that's exhausting, but it adds such a uniqueness to the product that, like, it's hard to find that anywhere other than literal fossils themselves. That's such a unique thing that's not usually, I don't think, ever really done.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing, I treat it as that I treat every piece like a bespoke piece of art, and I think that's the way I like to go about it. So I would take longer than probably anyone else would on each specimen, and I have lead times for each specimen, because they're not just casts and just thrown out. You get studios that will just produce multiple casts of things, and the casts get degraded each time. They're all unique pieces of art, all the way from like making the stands themselves. It's done to such a high quality that you could put it in a white gallery. And I think because of my artistic background, coming from working in art galleries and trying to present work like paintings and sculptures and things like that, I've got a different mentality to that. These things need to be precious and unique, and there's nothing like a fossil out there, kind of thing. You've got to have, if you can't have the real thing, make it as close as you can as possible. So I even have like inhibited the resins with actual like matrix from the field to at the request of clients, to like give it a bit more just presence and a bit of a story behind the sculpture itself. And I think that's important, that everything has a story and a meaning, and it's not just a piece of plastic or resin.
So could you go through some of the process of what it is creating a piece? What does it take to go into it, and what is it, the process, without just giving the trade secret away, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, there's no real secret other than essentially experience. I've developed over 10 years of working on dinosaurs, like a good understanding of the mechanics underneath the skin and the bones, and the anatomy in general of how things go together. And because of that, you start off by saying, okay, I want to make a Velociraptor, for instance. We'll go with a dinosaur that everyone knows. We'll go with Velociraptor. The first thing I do is I will go and I will find pretty much every scientific paper I can. Even if I have to pay for them, I'll pay subscriptions and things like that. And I will read as if I'm going to write a paper, essentially. And I will make things of note to do with the specimen, or I try to not to copy like holotypes or anything like that, because I think it's rude to tread on other people's toes who have got not necessarily the rights to things. But if someone has discovered a specimen, there's no point me creating the same specimen, because it's been done. Everything that I create is like unique, that it's like it honors certain things that you would find, like common traits and things like that. But the main thing I do is I embrace all of the research I can to make sure that I'm making the right decisions, and I go from there, really. And that's one of them. It's not even a trade secret. It's just hard work of, before I start a sculpture, it's weeks to months of just embracing every bit of information I can. And then from there, it goes on to the prototyping stage, where I will sculpt, and I will make a sculpture in a program called ZBrush, which is kind of what Disney and Marvel and things like that use to make models. It's an industry standard program. And I sculpt and create the skeletons, and they will start off very basic shapes, and gradually you'll kind of carve away until you get the right shapes. And then I deform them to make sure that they've got deformation as if they've been in the ground. I'll take a look at references of like, okay, how has this specimen come out if it's been, crushed, or, if there's a story about like the only specimen found was killed by something and it's had like all of its ribs broken. We don't have the ribs, so what would they have looked like? That kind of thing. I take all those little nuggets of information and try and combine them in. So for like my Bambi Raptor, I make sure that in a way that like it's a bit janky looking, if that makes sense. Like we have like the specimen itself, there's no point making it a clean model because you've got illustrations that do that. You've got like, the likes of Scott Hartman's skeletal drawings that he does. That's the perfect representation of the dinosaur. But when that's in 3D, you don't want it all perfect and lined up. You want to see deformation on the bones. You want to see that it's, that the neural arches are a bit compressed and twisted. So it's just making sure that you embrace all the information that's out there and what's applicable to the actual model itself, and then apply it. And that's kind of the main crux of it, really. Once we've got the prototype, it then moves on to a prototype print, and I'll usually kind of do that for, to make sure that there's no technical things missing, especially with detail. I don't want any of the detail missing, so I make sure the detail's strong enough. I'll also make sure that, the armature that I put in, because every skeleton that I have, like here, there's all metal work in the neck and in the skull. Everything has metal all the way through, so I've got to make sure that I boolean my way through, drill my way through with holes, and make sure that there's enough tolerance to fit the metal in, and that we're not going to have any breakages 6 months down the line. And it's just a lot of trial and error and going from there. And then you move on to the actual final sculpt, where everything gets finalized, and then I'll have several versions with different poses and things like that. And then it moves on to actually having the 3D print, cleaning all of that up and mounting it. And then there's some trade secrets that I have that I don't go into, that kind of make everything richer and kind of more precious feeling. And yeah, I apply those techniques as well as traditional sculpting on top, and then mount it on a custom bespoke metal stand. And that's kind of a very short window into the process. But every step is treated like it's, a personal piece of artwork for a gallery or a museum, and not just a 3D print chucked in the corner of, a lab or something. It's something very precious to someone.
So what is the process to know how to put the metal through the actual mold, or the mold? How do you know where to put it in, how thick the metal has to be, how thin it has to be like properly sturdy, things like that? What is the process there?
So yeah, that's kind of part of the prototyping stage. So for people listening, if you go onto my Instagram, you'll see that there's a large tyrannosaur, which is just under 5 meters long. She's a juvenile, about 4 years old or so, if not a bit older. She's quite large, but that was quite a high load to put on a metal frame, so I had to work out exactly what gauge of metal to go for. And basically, it's trial and error at the beginning when I first started doing this. But over the years, you get an instinct for, what load can be hung out, because obviously you've got, your center of gravity around the hips. And this is where the experience comes in with anatomy and things like that. That, most of the center of mass for animals is around the hips, and everything else is kind of counterbalanced, especially with dinosaurs, because their tails are usually, typical theropods and things. The tail is usually like, a bit longer than their head, neck, and dorsal. So you've got the center of gravity on the hips, and then from there you've got the counterweight. So if the skull is out here, you've got, say it's a kilogram, actually, because if it's 1.5 meters away, it's actually probably going to weigh about 5 kilograms, like that kind of counterbalance. So it's working out exactly how much you need to, essentially building a skeleton on the inside of the dinosaur again. So that's something that I just take into consideration at the beginning of the sculpt is, if it's a dinosaur that's only, got caudal vertebrae that are like 1 centimeter, then that is obviously just thin wire. But if it's something where, the caudals are like dinner plate size, then that is where you've got to get the welder out and weld metalwork together, and make it modular. That's the most important thing, is making sure that it can fit into buildings. So I've just done an exhibition for a lovely little UK museum called the Moyses Hall in Bury St Edmunds, and Bury St Edmunds is very much like kind of like the residential area in Harry Potter. Like, it's very British, very small streets and things like that. And when I got to the museum, it was a question of, how are we going to get a tyrannosaur through a door that is 5 foot tall and 2.5 feet wide? But we managed to do it by making everything modular with the metalwork and slotting it together on site.
So is it harder to make larger things with the metalwork, or like very small things, would you say? Because it's harder to like feed it through the actual mold or model because it's smaller, or is it fitting it that would be more difficult?
Yeah, so it swings and roundabouts, really. It's, if you've got something very small and it's, you're going through the process of casting it, then that's a nightmare, because an air bubble that is like 0.5 millimeter across is going to be catastrophic to, you're getting rid of the air bubbles with take a vacuum and taking it out. But if you get any errors at all in a small dinosaur, that's problematic, especially, as well as you say, you're trying to fit a 2 millimeter wire through a hole. So, the tolerances are so small. That can be tricky just because of the fragility of the dinosaur itself. But that's where I inhibit the resins with certain things that will make them stronger and a bit more flexible. Or I will cast in a bit more of a flexible resin for fin tails and things like that. But I'd say the challenge is probably more time. It's less than it's not really a challenge. It's time consuming for the larger dinosaurs, just because you've got loads to think about and you don't want to have a disaster. Whereas, a small dinosaur, there's nothing's really going to happen, because you get to a certain point where the gauge of metal that you use will just hold up, 10 times the weight that it's actually holding. Whereas when you're making a larger dinosaur, as I say, you've got this counterbalance weight that you've got to think about. So it's better to go over the top on the metalwork, I found. So the internal structures will have, really thick gauge metal going through, and the challenge for that then just changes into processing that metal. You can't cut it with like snips or a saw. You've got to get into angle grinding it, cleaning it up, welding it together, bolting it together, creating little clever 3D prints to like slot things together and things like that. And that's more of the challenge. It's just the technicality of how do you get, a tail that is 4 meters long on its own into a building, especially in UK museums. Like, a lot of the museums are very small, and they have residential entrances, because most of repurposed buildings from, the 1800s, where, life didn't call for large entrances and things like that. So that's when you've just got to think about the technicalities, and that's where it gets challenging. But I would say once you've got the method and you've sorted out the variables after a few sleepless nights, it's relatively straightforward. It's just making sure that you've got the know-how and the expertise to build it, essentially.
So for the counterbalance, whenever it's like a smaller model or mold, is it easier to do the counterbalance just because it's smaller, so it's less material, and therefore it can pretty much stand on its own?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the specimen, because you've got like the likes of, I've just finished an Equilops because of the Jurassic World hype. I had a few people say, can we have an Equilops? So like that actually has like ratio wise, it's got a ginormous skull, and the same for like the early ceratopsians like Psittacosaurus and stuff. They've got quite bulky skulls for relatively small skeletons. So that is just a case of making sure you push the limit of, you know, what gauge metal you can use for such a small dinosaur. If it calls for it, the armature can be on the outside as well. So I've had a few installs where I've done the skeleton in like a traditional way of treating the resin exactly like real bone, where it's gone onto a steel stand and it has welded flexible metal that clamps on, and bolts and things like that. And I've done that for some small specimens, and that's something I offer as well, because some people like the realistic mount look rather than like a seamless one. It kind of defeats the unbelievability, like the uncanniness of, okay, how are these bones all holding together? Oh, because there's a metal rod in the middle of the bones. That wouldn't happen, obviously, with a real skeleton. So having it underneath all of the vertebrae and things like that can actually make the counterbalancing a bit easier, because you can really bulk up the armature. For larger specimens, it's probably just, you can also add more struts coming down. So for like a large tyrannosaur, you might have some under the dorsal vertebrae, some under the caudal vertebrae, and then probably leave the cervical and the skull free to give that kind of grandeur of it looming over you.
And whenever you do it, do you usually go under the spinal cord or through it?
So it depends, because so if it's got a really like extreme neural arch, like a really big neural opening, that's just prime candidate for having metal armature going through. But usually the safest bet for the internal metal is to go through the centrums, usually, because that's like the thickest part. And it won't be seen either, because once it's all bolted or pushed together, it's just a seamless look. But yeah, if it's, you know, calling for you know, the large neural arches, then that's just an easy way to go, because it's something that's pre-drilled. But it's also down to the kind of what the client asks for, because as I say, you might get someone that says, oh no, we want it so we can take the bones off the stand, rather than essentially making a skewer. So yeah, it just depends what the client wants at the same time. But I would usually, if I'm creating my own specimen, usually, for instance, the Velociraptor, they're all going through the centrum, just so you can still have the neural arch and you can see the detail going through, and make sure you can get like the warping and things like that. So it's all hidden away inside the centrums.
So, I mean, what is the actual, like, you were talking about the base. What is the process of making the base? Does it have to be a certain like width and length? Does there even have to be a massive one? Does it have to be smaller? What determines what the base is like?
Yeah, so I would say the base, I mean, again, it varies, because you get some clients that will just want it bolted to the floor, and they'll have a system where you bring your stand in and it slots in. But generally it's weight. So have something heavy at the bottom. So I go for thick gauge steel, so that basically you've got to really like ram into it to push it out. Like, you've got to try rugby tackle it to get it over. So even for the small specimens, I'm going for plate steel that is really thick, and I cut that, I clean it up, and I'll weld in the supporting strut into that. And that's usually gives you the option to have quite small stands, so you can have like a 15 centimeter stand for a 1.5 meter Psittacosaur. It just gives you good options, but it does depend on like where their center of gravity is on the specimen. Obviously, if it's like a leaping specimen, you're going to want a larger stand, unless it's like secured to the floor. But yeah, usually it's down to weight and making sure that it's heavy.
Just a large base at the bottom to hold it down. So, I mean, that's actually makes a lot of sense, because, I mean, I'm sure dinosaurs' feet weren't that light either. So that probably was a similar method of holding them down. But what is it like a process making like a skull versus like a hand claw or a foot or just a tail?
Yeah, so the process of making a skull is very involved, I find. like I'm a fast sculptor. I've been in the industry for a long time, but I'm fast to the point where I will sculpt and then I'll take a moment and revert back and go back to like plan A and then move on to plan B kind of systematically and go backwards and forwards, because skulls are so complex and they vary. You know, we're away from that era now of the plaster cast, you know, diplodocus skulls where they're just smooth kind of, you know, what is it? It's like a house brick essentially with eyes. We're away from that, and you've got these complex structures on the inside, such as the brain case and things like that. And I really strive to find, you know, what it looks like on the interiors, and if it's disarticulated, because you can make a skull, but you want it to be realistic. So I make sure that it's semi-articulated or disarticulated, and use kind of clever ways to like pin it together. So some skulls will have metalwork inside to make sure that the disarticulated sections hold together. And it's just making sure that you get the details. So I'd say the process is really involved for a skull. The Daspletosaurus that I've kind of just finalized, and that's like in production now. It's in the studio, just ready for paint. That took a long time because it's amazing how many bones are in a skull, essentially, like how much is there, and to get it right so that you're not, you know, compromising the look, because it's especially for a lot of dinosaurs, it's very subtle differences that make it its own thing. And that's what I try to harness, especially on like the internals and things like that, and how the kind of skull assembles together. Yeah, it's quite complex. Whereas a claw can be very fast depending on the references. Luckily, we have a lot of like claw references out there, but the downside of skulls, unless there's been a in-depth paper done on the skull and like, you know, the similarities between that and other species, then you're kind of looking at pictures that people have taken, and people always take it from the same angle of 45 degrees looking at it, because it's got like the eyes and the jaws, and like, you know, everyone takes it the same way. No matter what you're taking a picture of, you always take it in a similar way. No one takes, you know, one directly in side view and top view back and that kind of thing. But as mentioned, I do try to avoid looking at real specimens / casts. I'll look at the real specimens, but if there's a cast, it's obviously had artistic interpretation done on it, and that's someone else's IP, that's someone's work. So I don't want to touch that. So I would rather go off a scientific paper and find, you know, what makes it the animal that it is, and infer my own information from similar species and things like that.
So the skull is obviously a lot more in depth because there's a lot more to it. Certain holes behind the eyes, in front of the eyes, not nasal cavities. Do you sculpt like this? I mean, I've never really seen what you've done up close yet. The inside, like, do you sculpt to the nasal cavity, like all the way through to where it's like you're pretty much holding a real skull, or is there parts inside that are just solid?
No, so I sculpt everything. So even like if I can get the brain case hollow, I'll give it a go. But that will come down to like, will it survive being produced? But yeah, with like the tyrannosaurs, like the nasals and things like that are all hollow all the way through. There's no like, you don't look into the snout and see just a wall or anything. It's hollow all the way through. And I make sure that I sculpt, you know, the other side of like the voma and like the palate and things like that. And I make sure that the reverse, because you'll get someone, especially a collector, and if they've spent, you know, a good amount of money, there is their pride and joy, hopefully, or if it's in a museum, and you might get that one person out of every 20 people that will take a look and peer in, and you want to make sure that it sells it, that, oh my God, they've got the internals down. Obviously it depends as well, because like I've got two different Velociraptor skulls. I've got one which is like hollowed out, And then I've got one which is based more on like a found specimen, which does have matrix still inside, but that's more of just an artistic thing of some people would like the matrix and having that look. But whereas a lot of people prefer the hollowed out. So I make sure I go all in and make sure that I do the research. And that's where it gets really time consuming, because as I say, people take pictures of the same angles all the time, and then not everyone's interested on like what the interior of the nasal looks like on a dinosaur. They want to know what its teeth looks like and things like that.
And on top of that, what is the method for, I mean, for lack of a better words, just hollowing out those like nasal cavities in the brain case and all of that?
So it's basically, I treat it like it's real bone. So you get to a point in the sculpt where it's gone from a ball of clay. So even if I'm sculpting it physically, because I have done some like some skull models where it's just physical, and then I've processed it back into digital form, just because sometimes it's quicker just to block things out in clay. But if you started with your block of digital clay, it's a ball, and then you've got it to the point where it's shaped like a skull, and you've drilled out all of the fenestra and the orbits and things like that, you're at a point where all of a sudden it's a tangible object of a real skull, and I scale it to the real scale kind of in the program, so I know exactly how it's going to be, and I'll print out a prototype at scale to see how thin the bone is, and I will push the limit to make sure that it's thin enough where it's real, because I don't like chubby looking dinosaurs. There's a lot of replicas out there or 3D prints where they look chubby because obviously the person has thought it's not going to survive the printing process for X, Y, and Z, so I need to make it thicker. So I treat it like real bone, and if the bone is 3 millimeters thick, then that's what it is, and that's the headache to work out later on when I produce it, is how to make it stronger so it survives, because that's where it sells as a real specimen, is when it's got that kind of, not translucency because it's bone, but it has that where you could almost like perceive light at some point through it because it's so thin and delicate. And it's just making sure that if a specimen is known for having really thin skull bones, that you've harnessed that. So like Bambi Raptor is quite like a gangly and delicate dinosaur. So I've made sure that it's not chubby, it's very skinny, and it echoes kind of what was found. And it's just making sure that you nail that really. So yeah, as soon as it's at a point, it becomes a real tangible skull, and I just treat it like that.
And what would you do for a specimen that doesn't have like the majority of it found? Like just off the top of head, like Australovenator, where we have like you can name on one hand how many bones of it we've actually found. What would you do if somebody asked for like an entire creation of that?
I'd panic. No. So yeah, if someone was to ask for something like that, I mean, it was a similar thing with Berthosaura. Like we had a lot of it, but there was still like, it was missing like the lower legs and things. And that was a challenge because with Berthosaura at first, there was reports that it might have had an arctometastarsal condition. I think I pronounced that right. But like how tyrannosaurs have the middle metatarsal pinched. There was reports that maybe it might have that because it's such a weird dinosaur. So at first you're kind of going through all the research, trying to piece together what it would look like. But basically it would come down to, is it phylogenetics or like their close relatives? And it would go from making good inferred decisions based on the research that's out there. Obviously, if it's a one of a kind, like brand new, we don't know what this is related to, that's where I would actually reach out to the experts in that field and say, I've been asked to create this reconstruction for this museum. This is the information that I've got. Can you shed any light? And make sure that it nails that kind of criteria. But usually, if there's something that's missing, we do have good relatives or cousins, kind of depending on how you view it. And it would be about making good decisions on, that 50% of this population have this very similar trait. So it's likely that this animal had a very similar trait, and you go from there really. And that's where some artistic license can come in. If you look at the old mounts, you'll see how much they've changed over the last 20 years. And we've just got to this modern point where everything's kind of looking very sports car like, and it's looking very refined and cool and edgy, in my opinion. And that's just down to because of our intelligence about how these things go together artistically has developed as much as the research has. So yeah, it's mainly just down to making the right decisions on relatives and kind of what goes with which.
And for specimen where it has, say, an unnatural hole in it, like a Edmontosaurus with a T-Rex bite wound, where the just T-Rex tooth would have just pierced right through the bone, what would be the process for creating that? How would you create that hole while keeping the structure of it steady and safe, if you will?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways. Like I pride myself on actually, as I say, we've got the Scott Hartman perfect skeletal diagrams. We don't need perfect reconstructions in 3D because that's, they'll look boring. So I do pride myself on actually like ruining the dinosaur a little bit, which is probably a bad description, but especially for like tyrannosaurs, they've always got puncture holes and marks in their skulls and things. So basically it's very similar to how you would do a fenestra and things. You drill the hole through and then you sculpt around it. So I would gather the research for an Edmontosaurus. If there's something comparable with bite marks, I will find exactly what it looks like, because you don't want to make it look like broken glass. You want to make it look like broken fossil bone. So I'll make sure that you get the right textures and the right look. I'll reach out if I can to researchers if there's not enough evidence out there. But luckily, touch wood, there usually is a lot out there for things like that. And for making it like structurally sound, it's just about prototyping it and pushing that limit to where it's stable, and you add polymers to the resin and things to make it stronger. That's where, like, if you cast, it can be really beneficial, because then you can really get like a high quality resin. And then you go from there, really, where you just push the limit to a point where you're happy artistically, and it pleases the kind of the scientific questions around it, but it also kind of is structurally sound and isn't going to break. And you can get quite far. Like the 3D printing and resin for molding and casting has come a long way. And we're at the point where you can literally get flexible resins. You can get really rigid and hard ones. So yeah, it's a combination of prototyping, combining the evidence that we've got, and really pushing that limit. And I'm a big advocate of really pushing what we can do with 3D printers and sculpture.
So what is the difference between working with those resins and actually physically sculpting it? What is it like working with those resins to like make it how it is versus just sculpting it from scratch?
Yeah, so it's weird, because the 3D printing method of having the kind of the bones come out of the 3D printer, it's like Christmas every day, because you'll come down and this specimen is just appearing out of the goo, the primordial goo, I guess. So you kind of got the process of seeing it come together quite quickly, because you've done the legwork already in the 3D program to get things moving. But then sculpting it physically, all of a sudden you've got quite a precious object, where all of a sudden it's as precious as a fossil, because you can't click resculpt, you can't click reprint if there's something wrong with it. And it's usually a master model where you've created a femur, for instance, which I've done before. You create the femur, you sculpt all the details that you need, and you either 3D scan it to preserve it, or you would traditionally make the cast. And that's where it's nerve-wracking, because usually your model, if it's made out of wet clay or wax clay, is probably going to get destroyed somewhat. So there's kind of like a precious kind of feeling about that and it can amplify a model artistically, because it gives you that kind of stage where all of a sudden you've got a sculpture that has come from something very organic and then gone into a very precious, one of a kind material. But it's just balancing the materiality between resin and ceramic, essentially, because that's usually what you're sculpting the masters in. Not for me anyway, because I find that like wet clay is faster to work in than wax. But yeah, it's just kind of combining the methods really to what suits the specimen itself, rather than just opting for what you prefer. So yeah, if it was a very large bone, I would probably opt to sculpt a master and then cast it, whereas small bones make sense just to 3D print because they're quick.
And for the smaller bones, for like specific claws or teeth, is it easier to just make one like master, will be the master file, and then just print it and then work on it?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the size. If it's a large claw, like if you're talking like a large baryonyx claw, then it usually it would make sense to create your master, print it at the highest quality possible, and then make a cast, like a rubber mold from it, and cast resin copies. However, I have found, I've been saying that that's the best option, but because of the kind of print farm that I do have, usually, we'll see how orders go, because the website had to go down because of too many orders. But if it continues the way it goes, then I'll have to definitely cast. But starting out, it was easy just to print them, because you get that quality, especially with these 12, 16, 18K printers that are out now. That the technology is crazy. So you can get, within 24 hours, you can get a 11-inch baryonyx claw off a print plate, and it's going to be probably better than the process of having to create a mold and cast it. But again, it's just swings and roundabouts. It just depends on how many you need, and what the best method going forward is. If it was a museum that said we need 50 of them, that's when I would say, okay, I'll just create a master mold and do that. But if it's just an order here and there, then it'd probably be 3D printed. But that's where I really push it, and I will try and print it solid resin, so it's not a hollow piece of plastic, or it gets backfilled with resin. So they're solid pieces, so they've got the realistic weight, because that's really important. I don't want to give someone a replica that's lightweight plastic. It's got to feel like something in yeah.
And I mean, I guess my final question for you today is like, why even do dinosaurs? What is the fascination with dinosaurs in paleo life? What do you think the reason that there's just so many people that this is such like a high demand type of thing?
Yeah, I think it's because it speaks to us on different levels, doesn't it? It's a very captivating thing. I think even if you're a dinosaur hater, if you were to take them along to a natural history museum and see a T-Rex skeleton in situ, they'd have a hard time saying that's not cool. And I think that's just the greatest thing about it, is it speaks to us on the child level. Like every day I'm at work, I feel like a big kid. I'm surrounded by the things that I love. And then for me, it changes as you get older, you appreciate the natural world more, what we've got around us, especially when like you see those funny memes that have been put out by like paleo people of, this is the skeleton of a penguin. If we actually drew it like a proper dinosaur, it would actually look like a fat mess and things like that, because we've come such a long way. And I think we're at this point now where artistically and scientifically we're getting accurate. Like we know exactly what these animals look like now. And the fact that technology's come a long way to give artists like myself a platform to, pretend that we're scientists essentially, makes it really interesting. And I think that's the main thing as well. It gives an everyday person can buy a skull and they'll feel like a paleontologist. They'll feel like they're watching Jurassic Park, and they'll have this precious artifact in their home. And I think that's something that's really key about this kind of realm, is it just keeps that fire and that childhood fantasy alive, because it is a big fantasy that these things walked around, but they really did. And I live on the coast, so I get to see really cool dinosaurs every day. I'm near the Jurassic coast, but the dinosaurs that I get to see are these massive seagulls. And if you've ever seen a seagull eating a frog or eating a fish, you realize that dinosaurs are not dead, because they are absolutely terrifying the way they will absolutely murder that poor innocent frog. And that's something you realize as you get older. You're looking at all these skeletons, and they are big birds, and they are these ancient animals that are alive now, but just in a different way. And that's really captivating. And I think it's really inspiring how things are moving forward. And the older you get, the more you appreciate it. I find it goes from just being, I like dinosaurs because I'm a child and I like it because of Jurassic Park. It just moves on to this all-encompassing, all-consuming thing where all you can think about is, dinosaurs. And it's been my life for 30 years now. I've just been obsessed with dinosaurs, and I don't think it will ever stop. I started off as a fossil collector 25 years ago, and haven't stopped. And I think it's just going to keep going forever. And I think that's why it speaks to people on so many levels, because there's so many different avenues, from media and film through to fossil collecting, through to visiting museums, through to books. And I just hope it gets more popular and more recognized that it's an important scientific thing for everyone.
It's the opening scientific field for children, and that grows into everything else, because it is just this fascinating, like, single set of studies. Well, not even single set of studies, but just set of studies about borderline mythical creatures. So, I mean,
yeah, definitely. I think as well, because, kids, we've all been a kid, and we can all remember that feeling with dinosaurs and things. And I think obviously you do get people who aren't into them, and that's totally okay. Everyone's into their own thing. But for me, I can't get that feeling of seeing my first dinosaur at a museum. I think it was Birmingham Museum in the West Midlands in the UK. They had dinosaurs there, and I saw my first dinosaur. And I was so young that I can't actually remember what the dinosaur was, but I can remember the feeling in my stomach, the butterflies that I got when I see my own tyrannosaur that I've created in a museum. And the fact that now that I'm doing that, and when I went to do some press at the museum, there was kids who had that, what I would presume was my look on their face, looking at my specimen, and then they'll get that feeling. And then, one day they might be doing this, and or they might become a scientist. That's just amazing that, it's a gateway drug essentially to get into this field. And I think it's important, and it's a shame that it's not taught in schools. Like in the UK, we don't really do dinosaur subjects. We don't do, prehistoric history. We just do history, World War I, World War II. That's history, essentially, Henry VIII. But we don't go back. And it does open doors. And the fact that you can go to a birthday party and kids will be able to tell you that, my daughter, who's 2, she can tell you how many thagomisers are on a stegosaurus. She says the word brilliantly. And it's incredible that that little spark is there, and I can see it, and I'm like, come on. And that's what I love.
And you get to see that imagination run wild, and that creativity spark in somebody anytime they see a dinosaur, get to think about it or just experience it. And that's having it in yourself is one thing, but seeing it on someone else just always somehow blows your mind even more.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you see, as mentioned, it's a kid that is barely able to walk, but they can name Saurophaganax, or like they can say these obscure names and they know exactly what they are, and they're like, oh, it's Gorgosaurus, and you're like, dude, you've only just learned to like walk. Like, this is crazy. They're saying dinosaurs before they're toilet trained, and it's you know what I mean. It's mind blowing that it starts that young, and I do think it's important. And I think that's one of my missions with this, is that it, because they are more affordable than what has been out there. It gives everyone the opportunity. So I've got a lovely client who's got kids, and he's bought a dinosaur for his kids' like room. And that's amazing to me. That's, you know, a really lovely gift and gesture to hopefully spark a future career or a future passion and love. And I'm very fortunate because I live on near the Jurassic Coast, that you get to see that on the beach. You get to see these kids who are picking up rocks and they think that they found, you know, a Scelidosaurus skull, and they haven't. They've found a rock, but it's, you know, it's that amazing nurturing mentality that all paleo people seem to have. We all want kids and adults to all join into this club, because it's a big community, but, you know, on the grand scheme of things, compared to like football and things, it's probably quite small on the world stage, but it's getting more popular, I hope. And I think we're in like a new golden age of dinosaurs.
Well, I want to thank you for just taking time out of your very busy day. I'm sure you have many orders to complete, but I just want to thank you for taking time out of your day to actually come talk to not just me, but everybody who watches this, and record your journey and what you do just somewhere. And it's always an honor to talk to people like you and other paleontologists.
No, thank you so much for having me. I mean, you've been there from like day one, really. You followed me really early, and we've touched base a lot, and we chat a lot. So I just want to thank you for your support. You've been great. And as I said, dude, get on the website and choose what you like, because I'd love to gift you a skeleton, because your support's been amazing. But yeah, if people want to check out the website, that'd be great. At the minute, it's closed for orders, but on the 17th of July, it opens back up again, and hopefully we won't get a mad rush coming through again. But yeah, thank you so much for your support, man.
And again, there's that website. You can't see the URL, but just dinosaurskeletons.co.uk. I guess .com after that, but just look that up and you'll find it. You'll be able to place your own orders whenever it opens back up on July 17th, you said. But again, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for just taking time out of, I know you have a very busy day. But it just always means the world to be able to actually communicate with somebody, and just, it honestly was just my pleasure to be able to support you in any way.
No, thank you very much, man. I really appreciate that. It's been fun.
And I guess that's all I have for everybody out there. I'm your host, Eric Crawford. That was Dinosaur Skeletons. And signing off, this has been Prehistoric Life Podcast. Remember, keep it prehistoric. Goodbye.